On a Tuesday morning, in a federal courtroom in Los Angeles, a judge looked down at a man who had been paid $150,000 a year to keep someone alive and sentenced him to 41 months in federal prison. That man was Kenneth Iwamasa, and with that sentence, the last domino in a 2.5-year federal investigation finally fell. This is not a story about a sudden death that no one saw coming. This is a story about a system that was built, piece by piece, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. A personal assistant who crossed a line so far past professional duty that it no longer had a name. 2 physicians who mocked their own patient in private text messages while accepting tens of thousands of dollars in cash. A woman federal prosecutors called the Ketamine Queen of North Hollywood, who ran a black market drug supply operation out of a stash house while her clients slowly dissolved. And at the center of all of it, one of the most recognized faces in American television history. A man who had spoken publicly about his addiction for years, who had survived near death before, and who died floating face down in his own hot tub on the afternoon of October 28, 2023. Welcome to the Murder Tape Chronicles. This channel exists for one reason: to follow the documented record wherever it leads, to separate verified fact from noise, and to give every case the full investigation it deserves. If you are new here, follow the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a full case breakdown. What you are about to hear is not speculation. It is the verified, court-documented conclusion of the United States federal case that began the day Matthew Perry's body was found and ended in that federal courtroom. With Kenneth Iwamasa, 5 defendants, 5 federal cases, 5 sentencings. This is the final one. Matthew Langford Perry was born on August 19, 1969. He grew up between Ottawa and Los Angeles, the son of a Canadian journalist mother and an American actor father, and he spent his childhood bouncing between 2 countries and 2 households. By his 20s, he was building a career in Hollywood, and by the mid-90s, he had landed the role that would define his public identity for the rest of his life. Chandler Bing. Friends. 10 seasons, one of the most watched television programs in American history. But Perry himself was always clear about what was happening alongside that success. He said so publicly. He wrote about it in his 2022 memoir, Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing, which became a bestseller in part because of the raw honesty with which he described his relationship with alcohol and opioids. A relationship that began, according to his own account, in his 20s, and that very nearly killed him multiple times. He described a period in which he weighed 128 pounds. He described 14 stints in rehabilitation facilities over the course of his life. He described a near-fatal gastrointestinal perforation in 2018 that required emergency surgery and left him in a coma for 2 weeks. Perry was not hiding his history. The public knew it. His inner circle knew it. The people who surrounded him in his final years knew it in precise clinical detail. In the last stretch of 2023, Perry had been using ketamine as part of what had begun as a legitimate medical treatment. Ketamine infusion therapy is a recognized clinical protocol, administered in controlled settings by licensed practitioners, used for treatment-resistant depression and certain chronic pain conditions. Perry had been receiving legitimate infusions. His last documented legitimate infusion, according to court records and federal charging documents, occurred approximately 1.5 months before he died. What happened after that infusion ended is the core of this investigation. The man who became central to what happened next was Kenneth Iwamasa. Iwamasa had worked for Perry for years as his personal assistant and had been his live-in assistant at the time of his death. His salary was documented in federal proceedings at $150,000 a year. His proximity to Perry was total. He managed the household. He knew Perry's schedule, his medical history, his emotional state, his prior overdoses. He was, in practical terms, the person most responsible for Perry's immediate environment. According to federal charging documents and the government's statement of facts filed in connection with Iwamasa's plea, Iwamasa began administering ketamine injections to Perry himself. He had no medical license. He had no clinical training. He was not a nurse, not a physician's assistant, not a paramedic, Not any kind of certified medical professional. He was a personal assistant with a needle. Court records document that in the final weeks of Matthew Perry's life, Iwamasa was injecting him with ketamine between 6 and 8 times per day. Let that figure settle. 6 to 8 injections in a single day, administered by a man with no medical credentials, to a patient with a decades-long documented history of addiction and physical vulnerability, in a private residence with no clinical monitoring equipment, no emergency protocol, and no oversight of any kind. The federal statement of facts further documents that Iwamasa found Perry unconscious on at least 2 separate occasions. In October 2023, in the weeks immediately before his death, he also witnessed Perry, according to court records, experience a physical response that prosecutors described as a complete freeze, a documented physiological reaction to a mega dose of ketamine that caused Perry's body to lock up. Iwamasa witnessed this. He continued to administer the injections anyway. This is where the psychology of the case becomes something that demands serious examination. Federal prosecutors described Iwamasa as having crossed from the role of assistant into the role of active participant in Perry's drug acquisition and administration. He was not simply present, he was the delivery mechanism. Iwamasa pleaded guilty to 1 federal count of conspiracy to distribute ketamine, resulting in death. That plea, and the statement of facts attached to it, form the documented basis for what is described in this episode. Now let me walk you through exactly where this ketamine was coming from, because Iwamasa was not the source. He was the endpoint of a pipeline that ran from licensed physicians to a black market distribution network operating out of North Hollywood. To understand the supply chain, you need to understand 2 doctors. The first is Dr. Salvador Plasencia. The second is Dr. Mark Chavez. Both were licensed physicians in California. Both were charged federally in connection with Matthew Perry's death. Dr. Mark Chavez pleaded guilty to federal charges and cooperated with prosecutors. According to his plea documents and statements prosecutors filed with the court, Chavez supplied ketamine to Perry outside of any legitimate clinical context. He was not administering infusions in a controlled facility. He was providing vials of ketamine in cash transactions, in arrangements that bore no resemblance to clinical care. The detail that federal records and multiple national outlets reported, and that prosecutors highlighted specifically in court filings, involves text messages between Dr. Salvador Plasencia and Dr. Mark Chavez, in which Plasencia explicitly referenced Perry's vulnerability as a financial opportunity. According to federal charging documents and multiple verified national news reports confirmed across independent outlets including the Associated Press and the Los Angeles Times, Plasencia's text messages included language asking how much this person would pay, language prosecutors characterized as predatory exploitation of a patient. Plasencia knew to be struggling with addiction. Federal charging documents allege that Perry paid approximately $57,000 in cash for ketamine supplies, for a substance that costs a fraction of that amount through legitimate commercial or pharmaceutical channels. $57,000 in cash for a drug that, according to pharmaceutical pricing documents cited in reporting by multiple verified national outlets, is commercially available to licensed providers at a cost of roughly $20 to $30 per vial. That gap between what ketamine costs and what Perry paid is not incidental. It is the arithmetic of exploitation. The pricing reflected not the drug. It reflected the leverage. It reflected what a wealthy, famous, addicted man in desperation would absorb without calling law enforcement. Dr. Salvador Plasencia was charged federally. According to court records and verified reporting, his case moved through the federal system as part of the broader conspiracy prosecution. The government's position, documented in charging filings, was that Plasencia and Chavez both participated in a scheme to distribute ketamine to Perry for cash, exploiting their medical licenses as cover for what was, in legal terms, drug dealing. But Plasencia and Chavez were not the only suppliers. They were not even the largest. The case had a third source, and that source is what transformed this from a story about 2 reckless doctors into something with a different texture entirely. Jasvine Sangha, Federal prosecutors, in court filings and in statements made on the record during her prosecution, referred to her as the Ketamine Queen of North Hollywood. That is not tabloid language. That is prosecutorial language, documented in open court. According to federal charging documents, prosecutor statements, and verified reporting confirmed across multiple national and local outlets, Sangha operated a large-scale ketamine distribution network. She supplied ketamine and other controlled substances to clients across Los Angeles. She maintained what federal investigators described as a stash house operation, storing controlled substances for distribution to a network of buyers that included, according to the government's case, high-profile clients funding a lifestyle prosecutors described in court as luxury level. The detail that federal prosecutors specifically highlighted in connection with Sangha's case, and that was confirmed across multiple verified outlets, including AP reporting and court records, is that Sangha had prior knowledge of at least one fatal ketamine overdose. According to prosecutors, a client of Sangha's had died of a ketamine-related overdose in 2019, 4 years before Matthew Perry. Federal prosecutors alleged that this prior death did not alter Sangha's operations. She continued to distribute. She continued to supply. The pipeline kept running. Sangha was convicted at trial. She did not plead guilty and was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Her sentencing preceded Iwamasa's by approximately 1 month, making Iwamasa's sentencing the fifth and final resolution in the federal case. Let me state plainly where this case stands at this point in the investigation, because the timeline matters for understanding what the evidence actually shows. 5 individuals were federally charged in connection with Matthew Perry's death. All 5 cases have now concluded with convictions or guilty pleas and federal sentences. The 5 defendants are Kenneth Iwamasa, Dr. Salvador Plasencia, Dr. Mark Chavez, Jasveen Sangha, and Eric Fleming, who, according to federal charging documents and verified reporting, served as a street-level middleman in the ketamine supply chain. Fleming pleaded guilty to federal charges and was sentenced prior to Sangha and Iwamasa. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner ruled Matthew Perry's manner of death as accidental. The cause of death was documented as the acute effects of ketamine, the water in his hot tub. According to reporting confirmed by the coroner's findings and verified across multiple outlets, showed no sign of struggle. Perry had drowned after losing consciousness in the water. The ketamine level found in his system at autopsy was described by the coroner as consistent with anesthetic induction levels, the concentration used to put a patient under before surgery, not a therapeutic dose, not a maintenance dose, an induction dose. The question that sits at the center of the investigation section of this case is the one I keep returning to as I move through these documents. At what point did this become irreversible? The federal record gives us a partial answer, and it comes down to a series of decisions that were made not in a single moment of crisis, but over weeks and months, by multiple people, each of whom had the ability to stop. Kenneth Iwamasa knew Perry's medical history. He had been inside Perry's life long enough to understand, in specific and personal terms, what addiction had cost him. He knew about the hospitalizations. He knew about the prior overdoses. When he agreed to begin administering ketamine injections himself, injections he was not legally or medically qualified to administer, he did not do it in ignorance. Federal prosecutors, in documents filed with the court, described Iwamasa's role as an active participant who acquired ketamine on Perry's behalf and administered it directly. The government's sentencing recommendation and the final sentence of 41 months, 3 years and 5 months of federal prison, reflects the plea agreement and the government's characterization of Iwamasa's role as serious but also of a different category than the physicians who monetized the addiction. Prosecutors distinguished between the doctors who charged Perry tens of thousands of dollars and communicated about his vulnerability in calculating terms, and Iwamasa, whose conduct they characterized as driven more by proximity and deference than by financial predation. That distinction is the government's, grounded in their charging and plea framework. The court accepted it. 41 months. Sangha's 15-year sentence reflects a different calculation. A distribution network, a prior death, a trial rather than a plea, and a pattern of conduct that the court found warranted the longest sentence in the case. The trap in this case, the structural vulnerability that the evidence makes visible, is not simply that drugs were available or that a famous man was addicted. Those are facts, but they are not the trap. The trap is the position that Kenneth Iwamasa occupied. He was embedded. He was trusted. He had access that no outside supplier could match. He had been placed in a role, paid, live-in, 24-hour, that was explicitly designed to be protective. And because that role was so close, so constant, and so trusted, it became the mechanism through which the final weeks of Perry's life played out the way they did. The protection became the exposure. The safeguard became the pipeline. That is not invented analysis. That is what the federal charging documents and plea filings show. This is also the moment to restate what the legal record is clear about and what it does not resolve. The medical examiner's ruling of accidental death has not been contested or overturned. The federal charges were for conspiracy to distribute a controlled substance, resulting in death, not murder, not manslaughter. All 5 defendants were prosecuted under federal drug statutes. The government's theory was that the distribution network, taken as a whole, was the direct cause of Perry's death, even though no single individual could be said to have acted with intent to kill him. That legal framing is why the sentences, while significant, are measured in years rather than decades for most of the defendants. What the record also shows, and what does not appear to have a clean resolution, is the question of how this network was invisible for as long as it was. Perry was a public figure. He had professional management, legal representation, and public-facing relationships with major studios and networks. He had written a widely read memoir about addiction that had been published only 1 year before his death. And yet, in the months after his legitimate ketamine therapy ended, the network that replaced it operated without detection until after he was gone. The federal investigation was opened after his death, not before. No intervention occurred. No licensing board. No management team. No professional contact. No building security flag. No emergency room visit in October despite documented unconscious episodes. Nothing intercepted this before October 28th. Let me give you the final accounting of this case as the federal record closes it. Matthew Perry died on October 28th, 2023, in his home in Pacific Palisades, California. He was 54 years old. The cause of death was the acute effects of ketamine. The manner of death was ruled accidental by the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner. Kenneth Iwamasa, sentenced May 2026, 41 months federal prison. Guilty plea. Conspiracy to distribute ketamine, resulting in death. Jasveen Sangha, sentenced approximately 1 month prior. 15 years federal prison. Convicted at trial. Dr. Salvador Plasencia, charged federally. Case resolved as part of the broader conspiracy prosecution. Dr. Mark Chavez, pleaded guilty, cooperated with prosecutors, sentenced. Eric Fleming, pleaded guilty, sentenced. 5 defendants, 5 federal resolutions. The investigation is closed. What stays open, and what I think is the question this case genuinely demands from anyone who has followed it to this point, is not whether the right people were charged. The federal record suggests the government identified the key actors and built a prosecutable case across a complex multi-person network in a relatively compressed time frame. The question the evidence forces is this: Kenneth Iwamasa was physically present when Matthew Perry lost consciousness from a megadose injection. Not once, but at least twice in the final weeks of his life. At that moment, in that room, watching a man he had worked beside for years go completely still, what would have needed to be different in the structure of that relationship for him to put down the needle instead of picking it up again? That is not a question about drugs or about fame or about Hollywood. It is a question about what happens when the person responsible for protecting you is also the person supplying what is killing you, and what systems, if any, could have seen that before the phone call that found Perry floating in 40 feet of water on a Sunday afternoon. Thank you for staying with this investigation through to the final chapter. The Murder Tape Chronicles exists because cases like this one deserve more than a headline. They deserve the full record, the documented timeline, every verified fact laid out in sequence until the picture is complete. That is what this channel is built to do. If this episode gave you something real, follow the channel and hit the notification bell. The next case is already in the record, and it goes places this one does not. This has been the Murder Tape Chronicles.